Hi, I'm Phil Tierney from Chester, Connecticut. You are listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley.
And it's time for Archaeology of Connecticut. And today we're missing one of our co-hosts, Brian Jones. We're missing him not being here, but we're sending him lots of love. And Scott Brady is here, our other co-host. But Dan Forrest is going to start us off introducing himself, and then each one of our guests will introduce themselves. And today we're talking about the terminal Archaic period and stone quarries. To me, don't know what that means. Can't wait to learn. I've been talking about it all week on air, saying I can't wait to learn about this. So we'll have two people on the phone. And are you guys there? We got you?
Yes.
There you go. Heather, are you there?
I'm here.
All right. Make sure you're talking to that phone real close. Want to make sure everybody hears you. Okay. So, Dan, why don't you start?
Sure, absolutely, everybody. Welcome to the July episode of Archaeology of Connecticut. As LRB mentioned, we are going to be talking about the terminal Archaic period today, and we're very happy to have a number of guests. Briefly to reintroduce myself, you've heard me before. My name is Dan Forrest. I am a lifelong Connecticut resident. I've been an archaeologist, primarily working in the state of Connecticut for the last 27 years.
He's stumbling on that one.
It's a little bit scary to think of it in those terms. But I worked as a cultural resource manager and on the regulatory side for many, many years, and very happy to be here. So if I can introduce our guests, and starting with the folks here in the studio with us, we have Bonnie Plourde. Bonnie, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about...
Hi, everyone. I'm Bonnie Plourde. I am a graduate of CCSU, Archaeology and Anthropology, and I worked with Heather Cruz on her dissertation with cremation burial sites of the terminal Archaic, and also excavated several years with Dr. Ken Fader at the Soapstone quarry up at the Walt Landgraf site in Barkhamsted, Connecticut, and currently am at the Barnes Museum, a historic house museum up in Southington, Connecticut. It's good to be here.
Absolutely.
Good to have you.
Okay, excuse me, Scott Brady.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm the president of FOSA, Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. I'm an avocational archaeologist, which means these guys are the really smart ones with degrees, and I'm going to ask the questions that most of us that don't have degrees are thinking about while they're talking.
Okay. And Marc Banks, can you kindly introduce yourself as well?
Sure, thank you. I've been involved with archaeology projects since the 1980s, including assessments, large-scale surveys, and CRM work. I formed my own CRM firm in 2001 and have collaborated with Dr. Lucianne Lavin for many years. Most recently, I've been involved with documenting cultural stone features in the Farmington Valley, which is my particular favorite since I grew up in that area.
Excellent. Thank you, Marc. And last but certainly not least, Heather Cruz.
Hi, I'm Heather Cruz. I did my master's and PhD work at University of Connecticut. As Bonnie said, I did work with her on looking at some of the cremation burials and some of the soapstone quarries. From that, Marc to look at some of his lithics that he had for the terminal Archaic. And currently, I'm teaching a couple places in Connecticut. Been doing archaeology for 10, 15 years. The time just keeps running. So that's where I'm standing today.
Excellent.
Hey, and Heather, just make sure you talk really loudly, all right? Because we want our listeners to be able to hear everybody.
I'm trying to scream. I'm calling from Canada. So
You are? All right, you're doing really well, and we appreciate it so much.
Okay.
No problem.
If I can, to sort of ease us into the discussion of the terminal Archaic, I think maybe if we step back and do a quick recap of the late Archaic episode we had last month, sort of set the stage for what is one of the most intriguing periods in Connecticut's prehistory. So for the late Archaic period, as we discussed last month, there are really two traditions that we often talk about, the Laurentian late Archaic and the narrow stem. And I'm going to emphasize the narrow stem here because this is the bridge, in essence, that leads us into the terminal Archaic period and a very interesting period of interaction. Among the various interesting pieces of this, for the narrow stem, these sites show up just about everywhere. If there's an archaeological site in Connecticut, there's probably a narrow stem there. If you haven't seen it, you just haven't looked hard enough yet. There are many, many running jokes about the narrow stem artifacts that archaeologists often joke about. But it is an intriguing period because lots of people seem to be doing very similar things, yet they appear to be doing that in somewhat constrained territories. So smaller parts of the landscape that they're using very intensely. And the other, interesting piece of this that leads us into the terminal archaic period is there does appear to be evidence of more violence and strife for the narrow stem archaic in particular, and to a certain extent the Laurentian. And that may well reflect this sort of filled up landscape and resource conflict, interpersonal conflict, social conflict. So if I can, I'm going to hand it off to our real experts on the terminal archaic and see if we can get a quick summary. So why don't we start with Heather? Heather, I know this was a major topic for your dissertation. Can you give us a quick summary of the terminal archaic and how it compares or contrasts with the narrow stem archaic in particular?
Well, during the terminal archaic, actually moving into it as you were talking about, you have this narrow stem tradition, and they're kind of all over the place in that late archaic. But you move into the terminal, so you're ending this archaic, this mobile populations, hunting and gathering, into the next period, which is the woodland, where people are starting to settle down a little bit more than they might have been before. And you see the appearance of possibly a new cultural system, or maybe just a subcultural system with a new point style, new cremation burials, new type of ritualistic behavior. And when I say ritual, I don't necessarily mean religion. I mean ritual in the sense of they're doing the same type of thing over and over again, whether it be using the same types of lithics or burying the lithics or the people in the same manner. That's the ritual that I'm talking about, not necessarily religious and gods or goddesses or something like that. You're seeing this type of shift, and then of course towards the end of the terminal archaic, you're seeing those soapstone technology come in as well, which implies a sense of sedentism, people settling down a little bit.
Okay. And Heather, can you remind us what time are we talking about? What time interval?
We are about 2700 to 3700 GP. Excellent.
Thank you. Marc, can you add to that or reflect on the terminal archaic? Because this is a period in which I know you've done an awful lot of research as well.
Yes. For the most part, what you're seeing is you're seeing more permanent, more focal type settlements along the larger rivers, whereas with the narrow point tradition, what you're seeing is, as Heather had mentioned, people are moving around the landscape more to more of a broad spectrum type of exploitation of resources. So they're, rather than having multi-seasonal base camps, they'll have base camps. They're seasonal, but they will splinter off into smaller groups. They'll have task-specific sites. So subsets of the population will go up to gather massed foods. Other subsets will be involved in hunting. So there's a multitude of different types of sites as opposed to what seems to be going on with the broad stem people.
Okay. And do we have a sense for what specific resources that they appear to be focused on relative to the narrow stem archaic?
Well, one thought is that massed foods, such as acorns in particular, may have been an important resource because it allows them to store foods for later use, kind of diminishes the need for a lot of mobility. Some testing has been done on the residues on steatite bowls, and Trunser, for one, has speculated that the appearance of steatite bowls may in fact be fairly directly related to mass use of acorns. Now, there's been other studies since that time that have found that a lot of other residues are found on steatite bowls, so it may not have always been the acorns that were important, and it may have been differed between different groups across the landscape.
Okay. Excellent. And Bonnie, I know in particular here in northwestern Connecticut, where you've done a lot of your research, there are some interesting contrasts, I would say, to what we know from other parts of the state. And in particular, you have evidence for rock shelter use during this period, which is not something I think a lot of archaeologists associate necessarily with the terminal archaic.
No, and it's a great site specifically for that. As Heather and Marc were just talking about, a little bit more sedentism. You've got complex that are seasonal, base camp with specific tasks. We've got all, we've got all of that at the Walt Landgraf complex between the hearths and the living areas that may or may not have had two different groups at two different time periods in it that Fowler had excavated at the complex, as far as what we have and excavated over at the quarry site, very specific uses of the space around it. We know where they were putting their garbage. We know where they were placing the soapstone that was harvested from the core out. Very task oriented, and it makes it very interesting to think how long they were there. Was it seasonal? Was this just for food production vessels? And does this go more into the rituals, as Heather was talking about, the importance of what soapstone meant to this time period?
Yeah, and I think this is really if you think, when many archaeologists are thinking about this period, there are two things that immediately come to their mind. One is the soapstone industry and this technology, which is, if not unique, it is an intense focus for this period. So it appears that the vast majority of the use of soapstone occurred during this fairly narrow time interval in Connecticut and southern New England in general. And then the other is the mortuary patterns, this ritual and the treatment of the dead. And so before we get into that discussion, it's really important for us to sort of step back and recognize, when we're talking about Native American burials, and particularly as archaeologists, we need to be mindful of the legacy of archaeologists with this particular topic. And so it's a very sensitive issue for many Native Americans. It's a very sensitive issue for many archaeologists. So we don't want to gloss over that. But it's also important to note that many of the sites we're talking about today, in fact, I believe all the sites we're going to be talking about today where there are cremation remains, were sites that were literally either salvaged from underneath bulldozers by avocationalists or were relocated or excavated by the state archaeologist when it was determined those burials couldn't be preserved in place. So this is not research that comes out of archaeologists trying to satisfy research interests or curiosity. This is data and information we have about these cultures that was acquired under unfortunate circumstances, but is nonetheless a very important source of information about these ancient cultures. So if we can, I think soapstone itself is an interesting place for us to start, because it is a sort of entry point into the subsistence patterns and what appears to be a major shift in technology. So, Bonnie, maybe you can start us off on that discussion. Particularly what's, I think, very interesting is the source of a lot of this soapstone being right here in Connecticut.
It's this beautiful, rare resource that when looking at it for the first time, you think, oh, great, it's a rock in the middle of, People's State Forest. And then the beauty of it and its multi-uses throughout time, even today, continues. There's something about soapstone that people have understood for a very long time. Again, it's countertops today. And
I was going to say, can I ask you a really minor question? Probably. I have a soapstone stove. Is that what we're talking about?
Absolutely. That's the same exact resource we're talking about.
Really?
It's found naturally on the eastern United States on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountain Range. And Connecticut is very lucky to have a few natural resources. Some of them are outcroppings that are bedrock, and pretty much everywhere that you see soapstone, it's been harvested and pecked at in some way, shape, or form. Some to the point of non-existence anymore, and others to the point where you can still see the beautiful carvings from it. Other portions throughout the state of Connecticut and around New England are glacial deposits, almost, where you get like a core, but beautifully done pieces that within itself, steatite is very interesting, because steatite within one core or one bedrock itself can change its mineral deposits, and it makes it quite unique. There's kind of more garbage soapstone that is, almost too talky and you can't do anything with, to the beautiful hard soapstone that today is made of the countertops that you're talking about in the wood burning stoves. So
excellent. So there are some important physical properties of soapstone that seem to be directly related to why it's used so extensively. And I think one of the most obvious is that it is much easier to carve or quarry relative to almost any other bedrock here. So it's more malleable in the sense that you can be quite creative in forms. And
it has been used very creatively.
Absolutely. And then it does have some very interesting properties when it's heated, right?
Yes, the heat retention stays. And again, thousands of years ago, they knew that. And for cooking vessels, it lends itself perfectly to that. When you heat soapstone up, it's very similar to today's stoves. You can rage a roaring fire within a stove and then shut it off, and it will stay warm for the rest of the night and continue to heat. So if you're breaking down the acorn type mast material, it would lend itself perfectly to that because of the heat retention.
Excellent. So sometime around 3,700 years ago, actually a little bit more recently, right? We start seeing the use of this material in a much more intense way. And there may have been soapstone. In particular, there are a number of objects that are not terribly easy to date that are made of soapstone that we're not certain, but they may predate this period. But there is a dramatic shift where suddenly these quarries are being used repetitively, and it looks like people are actually living at the quarries, at least seasonally, while they're working there.
Absolutely, for longer periods of time. Again, which is why the Walt Landgraf complex is so interesting, because it's not just a quarry itself, or not just a rock shelter. You've got definitive evidence for the connection between them both. Again, we found no hearths at all at the Soapstone Quarry. We know that they weren't living there. We know they were living at the complex. And even though there are earlier artifacts that may or may not predate the terminal Archaic, again, it's questionable dating. This rise certainly happens at the terminal Archaic and is very important to the subsistence strategies of the time, and just their use of.
Some of these pieces are pretty big and therefore
very heavy.
Yes.
So what does that? What does that tell us about how they're moving around the landscape? Are they taking it one place and it stays there, or are they carrying this around, or is that kind of leading us to think that they are definitely staying in places for longer periods of time?
I think the travel of soapstone is my favorite part of it. Looking through the outcroppings that you have in New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and then you go down to Long Island, let's say, where there are no natural outcroppings of soapstone at all. The artifacts that we're seeing there show that the movement of soapstone, even though it is heavy, having personally carried hundreds of pieces out of the forest myself, it's rather hard to do. But its connection with the Farmington River into the Connecticut River and that travel and trade, this was an important enough resource where they were moving around with it, and the cost of harvesting it out was less important than their need to take it out and move it. They wanted to. And I think Marc and Heather, too, would know a lot about that as well.
Yeah, and Marc, if we can, you would mention acorns as being possibly a very important part of the subsistence patterns. Is there a relationship between the processing of acorns and soapstone, or is soapstone likely used for a whole variety, for preparing or cooking a whole variety of different foodstuffs?
Yeah, it was Trunzer who I think was one of the first to discuss that the acorns were probably what led to the use of the soapstone bowls, because it was a better way to process them. Prior to the soapstone, they would have been using maybe wooden cooking vessels, maybe things made from animal organs, that type of thing, and they're not really going to hold the heat the way the soapstone does. Also with the acorns, there's some leaching involved, but I think that might have been a separate process where they'd have to leach out the tannic acid, which actually varies between the different species of acorn. Some are more acidic than others. But I don't think that was... I think these people used it for... Once they started using the soapstone, they were probably using it for a wide variety of cooking uses, probably deer, different kinds of, stews and whatnot. It was just a good vessel for a wide range of things, and it probably varied depending on geographically where these people were located and what resources they had available to them. At some point, when the sea level started to rise during this period, the environment changed somewhat, and that may have diminished somewhat the importance of the acorns. And from at that point, they would have been looking for other types of food sources that they could use to supplement what had originally been, the mast foods.
Okay, and I think one of the other interesting aspects about this is even though Connecticut had a number of really wonderful soapstone sources that were used extensively, it doesn't appear that this technology originated in our particular area. So, Heather, I know this is something that you addressed in your dissertation as well. Can you fill us in a little bit about the sort of history of soapstone use and the origins for the cultures that appear to be associated with it?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure if this is the actual origin, but some of the research that I looked at actually takes us right back down to the southeast. And anybody familiar with northeast archaic periods knows that our point styles, many of our point styles, our projectile points, arrowheads for some people, there's this pattern where it looks like they start in the southeast, so you're looking, Georgia, South Carolina, this area. And then it takes about 500 to 1,000 years for those technologies to kind of make their way up into parts of New England. So they kind of, span the Atlantic slope. I looked at a couple sites down in Georgia and South Carolina with the Savannah River, the Stallings complexes, and it's very interesting because some of my work is in social exchange, and I want to come back to that point talking about something that Bonnie brought up. It looks like, you have the coastal people that have some resources, and then you have, these internal populations that are using the soapstone bowls, and they were, a trade commodity. You have to think of soapstone not only as a resource for technologies, for cooking and everything that has been discussed, but, it's kind of the new shiny penny. This is a new technology which quickly becomes a commodity. And the mobility here for the non-archaeologists, what we're talking about for mobility is not only on foot, hand-to-hand type of communication, but Connecticut, at least, is filled with tons of waterways. You can put these inside your canoe and head in a couple different directions where, during this time period, it looks like you might actually have trade systems that are, getting started or maybe fully functional. So this becomes quite a commodity. And I remember standing there with Bonnie looking down at these quarries thinking, why would I stand here atop this hill? Because there's a quarry standing at my feet. And who has access to this quarry right now? That's me. So that gives me something that my neighbors don't have. And when you're dealing with populations slowing down and everybody looking for the same edible resources, you may be interested in kind of getting a leg up, having a resource that is a commodity that you can use to exchange for perishable resources, for food. So, this is, you see the use of soapstone bowls all throughout that Atlantic slope.
I think it's interesting too. Heather brought something up about we see the different styles of projectile points coming from all different directions. You can also see the difference in soapstone bowl styles, and you're able to really kind of look at that as a fingerprint of who's doing what as well. It's just like any other lithic technology that we have out there. So, you see these unpolished, they're finished bowls, or finished vessels, but, it's a little more unpolished. And then you're seeing, more of a smooth internal bowl, and, who's doing that? Why? Are they caching these sites to protect it? Because just as Heather said, once you leave, you're not protecting it. And if it is an important commodity, the way that we believe that it may be, how does leaving that affect you? Because certainly it looks as if they were coming back and back and back and back through time.
Yeah, and I think this is a great entry into one of the topics that Brian and I kicked around endlessly for this particular period, which is the terminal archaic, the people who are using this soapstone technology and all of the related lithic technologies are not coming into an empty landscape, right? They are interacting in probably a variety of complex ways with people who are already here. And in fact, in some cases, they're probably recruiting, or they're people adopting this new technology, right? It's not necessarily a wave of migration coming through, and we'll touch on that in just a few minutes. But there is likely already a fairly intense social landscape for people who appear to be living quite differently at the time when this technology is introduced and at the time we start seeing these sites around. What is intriguing about all of that is you do see for the terminal archaic that what appears to be this intense caching behavior. And it's not just soapstone, because you can't lug it everywhere with you, given its weight. You also see this in a lot of formal stone tools. In some cases, very large caches for dozens of these, what we call broad spears, in a variety of forms of very large knives that are made that were, buried intentionally, likely to be retrieved at some point. And it's an interesting idea to think you're in this complex landscape surrounded by all kinds of neighbors. How is that reflected in this terminal archaic culture itself, and how are they interacting with their neighbors?
Hey friends, how about if we take a break to thank our merchant partners, and we'll be right back with Archaeology of Connecticut. And friends on the phone, don't leave us. We'll be right back.
Come to Hillstead Museum in Farmington, Connecticut to experience art and culture in a magnificent historic setting. A visit to Hillstead Museum unlocks a 1901 architectural treasure. French Impressionist paintings, Ming Dynasty Chinese porcelain, Japanese woodblock prints and period furnishings. Enjoy a guided tour with interpreters who have the inside scoop on the family that created this landmark. Take time to experience the tranquility of Hillstead's sunken garden, or take in surrounding vistas of the Litchfield Hills while sitting on the Mount Vernon-inspired veranda. There is something for everyone at Hillstead in Farmington. Bring your friends and family to one of our many public programs, such as the Sunken Garden Poetry Festival, May Market, Heyday, or Holiday Boutique. Find a complete schedule of events at hillstead.org. Visit Hillstead Museum to take a step back in time, explore nature, or marvel at world-class artwork by Monet, Degas, Cassatt, Manet, and Whistler. There is so much to discover only at Hillstead. Please visit hillstead.org.
There's something about pairings that makes things perfect. What is the right beer to put with the right food? What wine goes with what entree? What style food pairs with my mood? Is it casual or dining room fare? And what entertainment will cap it all off? These are all great questions, and at Penny Lane Pub, we pride ourselves on being able to help you with the perfect answer. Hi, I'm Alex Folks, one of the new owners of the Penny Lane Pub in Old Saybrook. We celebrate our area every day by offering great things to pair with other great things, all in a pub-like neighborhood environment right here on Main Street. From our kitchen, we offer everything from classic pub fare to fine dining specialties. From our backyard garden, we offer the freshest veggies and herbs. Our wine list is world-class, and our beer selection rotates weekly with craft offerings that just need to be sampled. We'll help you explore palate-pleasing offerings in both food and beverage. Plus, we pair all of that with great music every Friday and Saturday night. And if you really want to explore something new, check out our tap takeovers, beer dinners, and special events. Come treat yourself to great food, beverage, and local music, all in a place where community comes together to enjoy and eat well. The Penny Lane Pub, 150 Main Street in Old Saybrook, or pennylanepub.net.
And you're listening to Archaeology of Connecticut, and we're having a very interesting discussion about the terminal Archaic, there you go, period, and stone quarries. It's so interesting. So let's continue.
Sure. So where we're going right before the break is this concept of a shared landscape, which we talked about for both the Middle Archaic and the Late Archaic, but that this is, there are different groups of people. Some of them may identify more closely with others, but they are rubbing shoulders, and probably not always in friendly ways, but in many other circumstances, they probably are setting up trade relationships and other complicated social relations with each other. It's in this context when we start talking about the burial patterns and the mortuary patterns where you really start to draw a brighter contrast, I think, in a lot of ways with the narrow stem Archaic, which many archaeologists would argue continues throughout this period as well. So we have potentially two contemporary, relatively distinct cultures. One of them has very elaborate mortuary patterns and ceremony. The other appears to be almost completely lacking in a similar pattern. And in fact, narrow stem, we talked about how the fact the sites are everywhere. You can't throw your trowel on the ground without bumping into one, it feels like some days. However, there are exceedingly few verified burials associated with narrow stem Archaic, and what we do believe we see is actually a variety of patterns. There's no one distinct characteristic burial pattern for the narrow stem Archaic that we can discern. So for the terminal Archaic, I think it's important to sort of tease out some of the details for how the dead are being treated and what that seems to reflect about the social organization for these particular people who are, if not moving in, their ideas, their technologies are being adopted by people who already live here. So, Heather, if you can pick this up, because this is, I think, a really informative part of the archaeology for this particular period.
Sure. The burial practice is very interesting, and as I said before, you do see a lot of parts of the culture associated with the technology, the soapstone technology, the point technology, also in the southeast and along the Atlantic slope. But this is where it's a little different. So the technology is there. That's moving up and down the coast, possibly just moving up the coast. But here, southern New England, reaching down, towards the Delmarva Peninsula, we're seeing a very specific type of burial practice. And people have to remember that during this time period, it's not like today where everybody gets a burial. This is labor-intensive, time-intensive. You have to have resources to feed all of the people that come to these burial practices. So it looks like only specific people are actually being interred in this manner. So we see a lot of cremation burials. What we have not found are the pyres. So if they are, burning individuals on a pyre, that is something we're not able to find. So primary cremation burials are extremely rare. We tend to see the secondary cremation burial, which means the person or people have already been cremated and then their remains are moved to one pit or multiple pits. So you could be seeing multiple people in a single pit, or you could possibly have multiple people that were cremated, and then you have pits lined up, and there really doesn't seem to be a worry that, if I was cremated, all of Heather gets in one pit. It's whatever, maybe I end up in multiple pits. Some of the pits are lined, some with sand, some with tools, and some of the tools are killed. So they're broken intentionally. And Bonnie and I looked at a number of these, and what became strikingly obvious as we're looking at them and, trying to delicately move them from place to place, was that the ones that were the most fragile, we had some quartzite that had been burned, and burning lithics changes the makeup of them, the chemical makeup. So some of these we were afraid they were just going to fall apart as we were transporting them. Some of these extremely large projectile points were very fragile, but yet were not broken at all. So care was taken to make sure that these did not break. Where others, we even had a hammerstone, which, for those of you that don't know, this is a larger stone, thick, I should say, that you use to actually, make tools. These were cracked in half intentionally. We could actually find pit marks in them that were intentionally driven in to kind of, destabilize it and break it into pieces. So certain tools were chosen, possibly, to be killed, to be broken before they were interred. Others were chosen or selected to not be broken. A lot of the church that I see that actually came from New York, which I think is a large resource in their trade economy during this time, that was broken, possibly, publicly. So my thought of this, I'm kind of viewing as if I'm standing there, is that certain commodities or certain tools were publicly broken in front of viewers, and then put into the ground or burned with the deceased. So this is a very different type of ritual process, burial process, than we see during other time periods.
So these cemeteries, do these appear to be single events, or do we have a sense that some of these are reused for multiple episodes? Do we have a sense for that, the time depth for this, or do we think these are singular events for aggregations of people who are there for that specific purpose?
That's a really good question. What we first need to do is figure out a nice, hard timeline for the terminal archaic, which we haven't all been able to agree upon. But some of the cremation burials look like singular events. Again, a lot of these are salvage excavations, so the archaeologists are only taking out the portion of the site that is in danger. So they're only partially excavated. If it's not in danger, we're not going to remove the burials. So from what we've seen, some of them could be singular events, but other sites have been used over and over again, which means you'll see pits, at a significant depth in the ground, but then you see pits on top of them, kind of carving into them. So we know that it's layered usage, basically. And I have to also tell you that some of these are extremely large burial sites. So it could be multiple use or one huge event.
I think what's very interesting about the burials as well, and Heather kind of touched on it a little bit, these tools that we were looking at some of these sites, they really imply specialization. So if we talk about that in a little easier terms, if we picture a community almost, if we want to call it that, that is changing from a more moving around nomadic lifestyle into a little more sedentary lifestyle, these resources, a specialist in just these tools, not only did they need to have the resource, but they needed to be willing to get rid of the resource. And if chert is a rare resource and that we're not finding naturally, and we don't find naturally in Connecticut, it was important enough for them to make a non-utilitarian and non-use tool, specifically extra large, specifically extra thin, and then either breaking it or not breaking it and putting it into a cremation burial pit. It really changes what we think in burials today. There is a sense of, you might leave something in a coffin for someone or whatnot, or leave a trinket at a gravesite. This is a really interesting piece of that, because that trinket needs to be able to be let go. And you need to have a person who knows how to do that. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. And I think one of the other patterns that is remarkable, because it extends beyond just southern New England, and in fact seems to be a shared pattern with different mortuary patterns in the Northeast, is this combination of, if not pristine, unused, purpose-made, or in some cases very lightly used objects that were placed at the very base of these features, and then above those are often what appear to be the ritually killed objects, right, or fragments of those with the cremated remains above. And that pattern shows up in Maine at a number of sites. In some cases, it's a combination of an individual who was not cremated and was interred with cremated remains above them, all in a single feature. And so I do think, and hopefully the listeners get this sense, this is a quite elaborate ceremony, and it probably does have tremendous significance. Those questions that we were talking about of how often these are reused, or are they reused, I think is an important one to try to sort through, and we do have a lot of work to do on that. But how often are these gatherings occurring? It doesn't appear to be annual based on the relatively small number of these sites that we're aware of. But what does it mean? How frequently is this happening? Is it based on a particular calendar, frequency, or is there some other event that is triggering the need to do one of these ceremonies? And to bring this back to where we were on the shared landscape, what do we think is the sort of incentive for the people to invest all of this tremendous energy into this particular ritual, and how is that being reflected in the material that we see coming out of these sites, or the patterns that we see?
Or who gets that treatment, I think, is an interesting question. Is this, the beginning of leaders and people who are at a higher status than the rest, and they get special treatment? Makes me wonder.
Yeah, and I think
that's a definite possibility.
Excellent. Yeah, please, Heather, expand on that, because I think this is an excellent question.
I think that's a definite possibility. I mean, in my mind, what I'm seeing, are multiple populations, possibly two separate cultures with numerous little subcultures, little pockets here and there of people trying to express themselves. So, kind of put it in baseball terms, you have the Red Sox and the Yankees. So why are all of the course, I live in Massachusetts, so I'm going to go with the Red Sox. Why are all the Red Sox getting together and doing things the same way? Because they're trying to express their identity and what's different from, the Yankees in a sense. So, just to put it in our modern terms. But here you have people kind of slowing down, maybe having a cultural identity that could be different from somebody living uphill. And, you have these burial practices where everybody comes together, depending on where you are. If it's the single burial that we're talking about, then maybe it's more of a local, small family gathering. But if it's, one of these larger burials that we're talking about, you could have kinsmen coming from miles and miles away. And, one thing that we've talked about, these items, these burial goods that are interred with the deceased, part of them, the broken or killed ones, we have a lot of evidence from cultures that also ritually kill the artifacts that were either made or used by the deceased. So that could be the broken ones, but then the ones that are not broken could be a social offering. So I would come to the cremation and I would offer lithics that are equal to my social standing. So if I'm in charge of that Soapstone Quarries down the road that Bonnie is talking about, then I may have a larger level of social prestige or a higher level than somebody else. So somebody could be offering a more local lithic where I have the ability to buy into something that's non-local, and therefore that's what I'm going to offer, and people may, see the prestige in my offering. So I definitely think there's a social ranking that is a part of this.
Yeah, and Heather, if I'm remembering correctly, at least one of these sites, the objects or the fragments of these kill tools that were recovered from multiple individual features, many of them refit. In other words, the fragments of the same original tool occur in many different features. So it looks as though, as you mentioned earlier, the concept that these objects were killed in a very public way, or in one part of the ceremony, there numerous different objects or different types of implements or tools are processed, they're killed for this next transition, and then various pieces of them are distributed into individual features. But if I understand correctly, there can be very significant differences in the amount of material or the quality of the material that shows up in these individual features. Does that suggest to you, further evidence of this kind of status differentiation for this period?
It does to me. Some of the sites that I actually looked at in my literature searches for my research, the smaller sites, possibly individual sites. Again, we didn't excavate the whole site was not excavated. They tend to have, local. Well, I shouldn't say that. They tend to have fewer types of lithic resources. The ones that are larger have lithic resources, the Great Lakes, New Jersey. We even have a copper point. You're going to see fewer local lithics and just an abundance of non-local. And you're going to see very few of these in the sense of, you only have one jasper point or, one argillite or something like that, which are different types of lithics, instead of, 30% of the site being one lithic. You're going to see one of everything in a sense of these very large sites, which looks like people are possibly bringing what they have from different locations outside of the local region.
Heather, do you think that there's like a sphere of influence where these customs are originating perhaps in the southeast, And then as you get further and further away from that, that may explain some of the differences in the intensity of these rituals?
Possibly. I mean, I'm not even sure if, you still have that age-old conversation of, migration to fusion. Where did these people come from? So, this isn't even something that I've seen in the Southeast.
Right, and I think that is it is a very intriguing aspect of this, because we always think of the sort of donor area, the core area. I'm saying always, this is over the last 30 years in particular, we focused on this concept, but that the Savannah River, Stallings as the sort of parent culture for this, but what's lacking in those southeastern sites is this mortuary ceremonialism. The burials there are primarily interments, if I understand correctly. So this cremation tradition, this ritual, does potentially have roots here in the Northeast. It, in some respects, seems to be grafted onto this technology, or these, and potentially adopted by these people who are moving into the region. And I think that, again, this may be part of this really complicated social atmosphere, this social landscape that people are encountering in this sort of filled landscape where there's more competition amongst individuals and potentially, within communities. So that piece of it, I think, Marc, I'm gonna call you out, because you and I, our grad schooling had a particular flavor in talking about this time period, and so Heather touched on this very briefly. The idea, if there is a contemporary narrow stem tradition in Connecticut, while what we think of as the terminal archaic or the Susquehanna tradition is taking up space, it always seems to be the division of the lowlands and the rivers are, the sort of prime parts of the landscape are occupied by the Susquehanna tradition people, and the narrow stem folks have retreated to the hills, or they've been pushed out to the hills. Does that still strike you as a reasonable sort of broad picture of the landscape now?
Well, it does to some extent. There's one instance I'd like to bring up. It was when Lucianne Lavin and I worked at Connecticut Yankee when the plant was decommissioned about 12 years ago. We had what we interpreted as a fall-winter base camp on Dibble Creek, not far from the Salmon River. And that was predominantly, it was a narrow stem occupation. But right in the heart of that narrow stem occupation, we had a blade cache, which was 29 pieces, which were broad spear blades. They were stacked in layers with a small amount of sand between them, probably to keep them from fracturing. And they were made of a number of materials: non-local chert, slate, basalt, hornfels. And this is right in the heart of a narrow stem occupation. And we had narrow stem points at the same level, some of them, as with the cache. And even though we're close to the river, we didn't find any evidence for fishing at this site. So we interpreted it as a fall, winter occupation, and the points would have been ideal for dressing animals. These were predominantly knives. They were very asymmetrical. The stem was off extremely to one side, not centered at all. And there's a probability there that the narrow stem people that were occupying the site bartered those from the broad spear people in the same general area there. I mean, there's other scenarios for that, but that seems like a likely possibility. So, instead of seeing that there might have been some strife between these two groups, we didn't find anything there that would suggest that.
And I think that is, so this question of what the relationships might have been, for people and also within some of these communities, we don't know, in part because, the preservation issues that we're confronted with for the types of evidence when people are not being nice to each other, let's say, it's very rare. It's rare for this period, and when we do see that evidence, it's primarily in a very specific context, such as shell middens. And there are not a huge number of terminal archaic shell middens in this region. So we are speculating, and we're drawing on evidence from regions that are pretty far afield, and assuming that those conditions pertained here in southern New England as well. But I think that it's quite possible that there are favorable sort of economic and social relations among some of these populations, and in other cases it may not be quite so friendly. So in that context, do we see these, is there a thread through this soapstone industry, this sort of very elaborate exchange network that we see with, as we're talking about New York chert, soapstone, and this mortuary ceremonialism? Do we stitch these together in a particular way, or are these still wide open questions for all of us? We've got like 2 minutes left. So, Marc, if you can give us your 30-second overview, and then we'll run around the table.
Okay, well, I think the jury's still out on many of the aspects of the whole terminal archaic, as far as we're not certain about the actual migration, whether the broad spirits are part of a change in technology that was being employed by people from the narrow stem tradition. We don't know to what extent, like, for instance, the rock shelter up in Barkhamsted, that was probably used by different groups during different seasons. I've looked at some of the points that Bonnie shared with me on that were at the Peabody, the ones that Fowler and Rouse had excavated there. And, there's a wide range of different points in there. There are some broad points, but a lot of narrow stem points. If people are working up at that quarry, I think they...
Hey, Marc, you used up your 30 seconds. I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Bonnie, can you jump in really quickly here?
I think just what's interesting about the terminal archaic, there are so many open answered questions. We understand about the dating questions we have, as Heather alluded to. We don't have exact dates yet, research coming out. The new research coming that is trying to fingerprint which soapstone is coming out of which quarry, I think is going to help sum up some of these questions, because as of right now, it appears we have southern New England in our little town, the state of Connecticut, being like a super highway of this soapstone technology, and it's exciting to be a part of it.
Fantastic. So. Thank you all very much. You've been fantastic guests. I really appreciate the discussion, and we're going to hand it back to RB.
You've been listening to Archaeology of Connecticut on ICRV Radio. You are listening to ICRV Radio, the stream that feeds the river valley, where we make local matter.